Every night at exactly 11:45, in the winter of 1943, a guard at a Nazi labor camp in occupied Poland would walk his final patrol route before the midnight shift change. His boots crunched through the snow in a predictable pattern that prisoners had memorized after weeks of careful observation. But what the camp commandant never knew, what the other SS guards never suspected, was that this man was committing an act of treason so subtle and so dangerous that discovery would mean immediate execution. For 3 months, Guard Sergeant Hans Müller deliberately left the eastern gate unlocked every single night, creating a window of exactly 17 minutes where prisoners could slip into the frozen forest and vanish into the darkness. This is the story they buried, the impossible act of defiance that saved lives in the heart of hell itself, and the question that still haunts historians today is simply this: why would a member of the SS, a man who had sworn an oath to Hitler himself, risk everything to let his enemies escape? The Gross-Rosen labor camp sat in the industrial heartland of Lower Silesia, a region the Nazis had transformed into a sprawling network of forced labor, sites designed to fuel the German war machine. By late 1943, over 40,000 prisoners were scattered across its subcamps, working themselves to death in granite quarries and armament factories. These were not the extermination camps like Auschwitz or Treblinka, where death came quickly in gas chambers, but rather places where death arrived slowly through exhaustion, starvation, and the brutal cold of the Polish winter. The prisoners were mostly political enemies, resistance fighters, Soviet POWs, and Jews deemed healthy enough to work before their inevitable end. The guards who watched over them were a mixture of SS veterans, older Wehrmacht soldiers deemed unfit for the front lines, and younger recruits being hardened for eventual combat duty. Life expectancy for a prisoner rarely exceeded 6 months, and escape was considered virtually impossible due to the harsh terrain, the network of informants in surrounding villages, and the standing order that any guard who allowed an escape would face court-martial and likely execution himself. Hans Müller had arrived at Gross-Rosen in September of 1943 after serving 2 years on the Eastern Front, where he had witnessed atrocities that hollowed him out from the inside. He was 31 years old, a former schoolteacher from Bavaria who had joined the Nazi Party in 1937, not out of ideological fervor, but because party membership had become essential for government employment. His war began with patriotic enthusiasm that curdled into horror somewhere between Minsk and Smolensk, where he watched SS Einsatzgruppen units execute entire villages while Wehrmacht officers looked the other way. By the time he was transferred to Gross-Rosen, following a shrapnel wound to his left leg that left him with a permanent limp, Müller was a man who no longer believed in the cause he served, but was trapped within it by fear, duty, and the knowledge that questioning orders meant death. He requested the night watch specifically because it kept him away from the daytime brutality, the beatings and executions that happened when the commandant made his rounds. The transformation from passive observer to active saboteur began on a November night so cold that the guard towers themselves seemed to shake. Müller was conducting his 11:30 patrol when he discovered a young prisoner, a Polish boy who could not have been older than 16, frozen to death just 3 meters from the fence line. The boy had clearly been trying to reach the gap in the wire that everyone whispered about, but no one dared attempt, driven by desperation to escape, or perhaps simply choosing to die in pursuit of freedom rather than wait for starvation to claim him. Something in Müller broke that night, some final thread of self-deception that had allowed him to tell himself he was just following orders, just surviving, just doing his duty. He stood over that frozen boy for nearly 20 minutes, the wind howling around him, and made a decision that would define the rest of his short life. The Eastern Gate was the camp's weakest point, a fact that Müller had noted during his first week, but had reported to no one. It sat at the terminus of the patrol route, partially hidden by a storage building that blocked sight lines from the nearest guard tower. The lock was old and temperamental, requiring a specific technique to ensure it fully engaged, something the camp's stretched resources and indifferent maintenance crews had never addressed. Müller realized that if he simply failed to apply that final pressure, if he left the lock appearing closed but actually unengaged, A prisoner who knew what to look for could open it with bare hands and slip through. The risk was enormous because the next guard shift would discover the deception when they checked the locks at midnight. But Müller had noticed something crucial about human nature in military bureaucracy. The midnight shift guards were lazy, cold, and eager to get inside to the warmth of the guardhouse, and they had begun skipping the physical lock checks in favor of simply assuming the evening shift had done their job properly. For 3 nights Müller left the gate unlocked and waited, terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, wondering if anyone would notice, if anyone would dare try, and what price he would pay for this betrayal. On the 4th night, when he made his dawn patrol before going off duty, he found footprints in the fresh snow leading away from the eastern gate toward the tree line, and he knew that someone had taken the chance he offered. Müller carefully swept snow over the tracks with a pine branch and returned to his barracks, where he lay awake, trembling with the knowledge that he had just committed treason against the Third Reich and saved at least 1 life in the process. The question that consumed him as dawn broke over the frozen camp was whether he had the courage to do it again, and the answer that rose from somewhere deep within him was a single word that would seal his fate: yes. The system Müller developed over the following weeks was built on careful observation of human patterns and the exploitation of institutional laziness that pervades all military bureaucracies. He learned that the midnight shift consisted of 2 guards who rotated their duties, and both men were older Wehrmacht transfers who viewed camp duty as preferable to freezing in a trench on the Eastern Front. They had developed a routine where one would make a cursory walk of the inner perimeter while the other prepared coffee in the guardhouse, and neither bothered with the time-consuming task of physically checking every lock when they could simply assume their predecessor had done his job. Müller capitalized on this by ensuring his paperwork was always immaculate, his reports always filed on time, and his demeanor always exactly what was expected of a competent, if unremarkable, SS guard. He became invisible through perfect mediocrity, the kind of soldier superiors never remember, because he never gives them reason to notice him. The prisoners who discovered the unlocked gate had their own intelligence network, a whispered communication system that moved information through the barracks with remarkable speed and efficiency. Word spread through careful channels that the eastern gate was vulnerable during a specific window each night, though no one understood why or suspected it was deliberate sabotage rather than simple negligence. The bravest or most desperate prisoners began to watch Müller's patterns, timing his patrol route down to the minute, learning to recognize the specific sound of his boots and the rhythm of his movements. They discovered that he would pass the eastern gate at 11:45, and the next guard would not reach that position until 12:17, creating exactly 32 minutes of opportunity. What they did not know, what Müller could never tell them, was that he was deliberately slowing his final patrol lap by approximately 4 minutes each night to expand that window even further. The first confirmed escape that Müller knew about happened on November 23, 1943, when 3 Soviet prisoners of war vanished during the night. The camp erupted into chaos the following morning when roll call came up short, and the commandant ordered a full investigation that had Müller's heart hammering in his chest as investigators questioned every guard on duty. He maintained his composure by telling himself that fear was natural, that any guard would be terrified of being blamed for an escape, and his anxiety therefore appeared entirely appropriate to his interrogators. The investigation concluded that the prisoners had somehow cut through the wire on the northern perimeter, a theory supported by old damage to the fence that had never been properly repaired, and Müller felt a dizzying mixture of relief and guilt as he realized his sabotage had been successful enough to misdirect the entire investigation. But success brought new complications because the camp administration responded by increasing patrols and installing additional spotlights around the perimeter, improvements that made Müller's window of opportunity narrower and more dangerous. He adapted by varying his routine slightly, sometimes leaving the gate unlocked and sometimes securing it properly, creating an unpredictable pattern that prevented prisoners from becoming too confident and potentially careless. This randomness also served as self-protection, because if too many escapes occurred in too short a period, even the incompetent midnight shift would eventually notice the pattern and investigate the eastern gate more carefully. Müller was walking a razor's edge between saving lives and preserving his cover, knowing that discovery meant not just his own execution, but the end of the escape route for everyone who might still use it. The winter deepened, and the death rate in the camp accelerated as temperatures plummeted, and rations were cut to redirect food supplies to the crumbling eastern front. Müller watched prisoners die daily from exposure, starvation, and the casual brutality of guards who had become desensitized to suffering, and each death reinforced his conviction that what he was doing mattered, even if he could only save a handful among thousands. He began leaving the gate unlocked more frequently, accepting greater risk, because the alternative was watching more young men freeze to death 3 meters from freedom. And something in him had decided that his own survival was worth less than their chance at life. By December of 1943, Müller had facilitated at least 11 successful escapes, though he could never know the exact number because prisoners who made it through the eastern gate vanished into the forest without leaving confirmation of their survival. The uncertainty gnawed at him during sleepless days when he lay in his barracks listening to other guards joke about escaped prisoners freezing to death in the woods or being shot by Polish partisans who distrusted everyone. He tortured himself with the possibility that he was not saving lives but merely changing the location of their deaths, sending desperate men into a frozen wilderness where starvation or exposure would claim them just as certainly as the camp itself. But then he would remember the frozen boy from November, and he would tell himself that dying in pursuit of freedom was still a better death than waiting passively for the end, and this rationalization allowed him to continue his nightly betrayal of everything he had once sworn to uphold. The transformation of Hans Müller from reluctant participant to active resistor accelerated his internal deterioration in ways he had not anticipated. He began drinking heavily during his off hours, not enough to impair his duties, but sufficient to quiet the voices in his head that screamed conflicting demands about duty, morality, and survival. Other guards noticed his increased alcohol consumption, but attributed it to the same general despair that affected everyone stationed in the camp, that slow spiritual death that came from spending your days surrounded by human misery while pretending it was necessary for the greater good. Müller's commanding officer even commended him once for his steady performance, despite the obvious strain of camp duty, completely missing the irony that the strain came not from enforcing the Nazi system, but from systematically undermining it. The loneliness of his secret was perhaps the worst part, because he could never share his actions with anyone, could never seek validation or support, could never even acknowledge to himself in writing what he was doing for fear that a diary or letter might be discovered after his inevitable death. The camp's internal resistance network, such as it existed, operated in complete ignorance of Müller's role in the escapes. Prisoner leaders assumed the Eastern Gate weakness was either incompetence or a trap designed to identify potential escapees for punishment. And heated debates occurred in whispered conversations about whether attempting the route was worth the risk. Some prisoners argued it was too convenient, too obvious, and must be a deliberate setup by the SS to justify collective punishment or executions. Others maintained that the Nazis were simply arrogant and sloppy, that their belief in their own superiority made them careless about details like lock maintenance and patrol schedules. What none of them considered was that a guard might be deliberately creating opportunities for escape, because such a thing was so far outside their experience of SS behavior that it literally did not occur to them as a possibility. This cognitive blind spot worked in Müller's favor because prisoners who successfully used the Eastern Gate never thought to thank him or acknowledge his role. They simply fled and never looked back. The camp commandant, Sturmbannführer Klaus Reinhardt, was a career SS officer whose incompetence was matched only by his ambition to avoid notice from his superiors in Berlin. He ran Grossrosen with minimal effort, delegating most actual decisions to subordinates while focusing his energy on ensuring his paperwork indicated maximum productivity with minimum problems. Escapes were problems, but they could be managed through creative accounting that reclassified dead prisoners as transfers to other camps or listed escapees as deceased from natural causes. Reinhardt's primary concern was maintaining the fiction of control rather than exercising actual control, which meant that as long as the total prisoner count in his reports matched expectations and production quotas were met, he remained willfully blind to the grinding reality of daily operations. This institutional corruption and bureaucratic self-deception created the exact conditions that allowed Müller's sabotage to continue undetected, because no one in the command structure actually wanted to look too closely at anything that might require them to take responsibility or make difficult decisions. Christmas of 1943 arrived with heavy snow and temperatures that dropped to -15 degrees Celsius, conditions that made escape attempts nearly suicidal, but also provided cover in the form of reduced visibility and guards who shortened their patrols to minimize exposure to the cold. Müller left the eastern gate unlocked on Christmas Eve, a gesture that felt both deeply meaningful and utterly futile, and he spent the holiday sitting alone in the guard barracks drinking schnapps and wondering if anyone would even attempt an escape on such a brutal night. The next morning, roll call revealed that 2 prisoners were missing, and Müller felt something that might have been joy or might have been grief as he realized that somewhere in the frozen forest, 2 men were either dying free or making their way toward a future that the Third Reich had tried to steal from them. January of 1944 brought a crisis that nearly ended Müller's operation before it could save anyone else. A new security officer arrived at Gross Rosen, a young and ambitious Oberscharführer named Werner Dietrich, who had distinguished himself hunting partisans in Ukraine and carried with him a reputation for fanatical thoroughness. Dietrich had been sent specifically to tighten security after Berlin noticed statistical anomalies in the camp's escape rates compared to similar facilities, and he approached his assignment with the zeal of a true believer who saw every breach as a personal insult to Nazi authority. Within his first week, Dietrich implemented random patrol inspections, surprise lock checks at irregular hours, and a new requirement that guards document every aspect of their rounds in detailed logbooks that would be reviewed daily. The entire guard complement felt the increased scrutiny, but for Müller each new procedure represented a potential tripwire that could expose his carefully constructed system and send him to a firing squad. The first time Dietrich conducted a surprise inspection during Müller's shift, appearing suddenly at the eastern gate at 11:53 with a flashlight and a suspicious expression, Müller experienced a moment of pure terror that he managed to conceal beneath a mask of professional composure. He had locked the gate properly that night, one of his random secured nights, and his paperwork was immaculate as always, which seemed to frustrate Dietrich, who was clearly hoping to find incompetence he could punish as an example to others. The young officer spent 20 minutes examining the gate, the lock mechanism and the surrounding area, while Müller stood at attention answering questions with exactly the right mixture of respect and confidence. Dietrich finally dismissed him with a warning that standards had been too lax under the previous administration and that every guard would now be held to the highest level of accountability. Müller returned to his barracks that night and vomited from the stress, knowing that his window for sabotage had just narrowed to almost nothing. For 3 weeks, Müller did not leave the eastern gate unlocked at all. He secured it properly every night and focused entirely on appearing to be the model guard that Dietrich demanded, understanding that survival required him to become temporarily invisible within the new security regime. The forced pause in his rescue efforts filled him with guilt and frustration, but he rationalized that being caught and executed would help no one, and that patience now might allow him to resume operations later, when Dietrich's initial enthusiasm inevitably faded. He watched other guards stumble under the increased pressure, saw men punished for minor infractions that would have been ignored a month earlier, and he learned everything he could about Dietrich's patterns and preferences by observing how the security officer conducted his surprise inspections and what specifically he looked for during his reviews. What Müller discovered was that Dietrich, despite his reputation for thoroughness, was fundamentally a creature of rigid routine disguised as randomness. The security officer conducted his surprise inspections at irregular hours, but always within certain time windows, never before 2200 hours and never after 0200, because he maintained a strict sleep schedule that he believed essential for mental sharpness. Dietrich also focused his attention disproportionately on the northern and western perimeters, because those areas had been identified in Berlin's report as the likely escape routes based on the falsified investigation from November. The Eastern Gate, which had been attributed to careful guard work in official reports, received less scrutiny precisely because the paperwork indicated it was being properly managed. Müller realized with dark irony that the lies told to cover up previous escapes had actually created a blind spot in the new security regime, and that if he was patient and careful, he might be able to exploit Dietrich's own assumptions against him. By late January, Müller had identified a new window of opportunity. Dietrich conducted most of his eastern perimeter inspections on weekends when he was trying to catch guards being lazy before their days off, which meant weeknight shifts received less scrutiny. Additionally, the security officer had developed a pattern of focusing intensely on one section of the camp for several days before rotating his attention elsewhere, and Müller learned to track these rotation patterns through casual conversations with other guards who complained about being under the microscope. On the night of January 27th, with Dietrich occupied investigating suspected theft in the supply depot and the midnight shift staffed by the two laziest guards in the rotation, Müller left the Eastern Gate unlocked for the first time in nearly a month. His hands shook as he walked away from it, and he spent the rest of his patrol certain that this would be the night everything collapsed. But when dawn came and roll call revealed no missing prisoners, he felt an unexpected disappointment that mixed with his relief. The psychological toll of living a double life began to manifest in ways Müller could no longer fully control. He developed a nervous habit of touching his left pocket, where he kept a small photograph of his sister's children, a gesture that provided momentary comfort but also drew occasional curious glances from other guards who wondered what talisman he was checking so compulsively. His sleep, already poor, deteriorated into something closer to brief periods of unconsciousness, punctuated by nightmares where he was simultaneously the guard shooting escapees and the prisoner being shot, a confusion of identity that left him waking in cold sweats multiple times each night. Other guards began to give him slightly wider berth, sensing something unstable beneath his professionally correct exterior. But no one suspected the truth, because the idea of an SS guard actively helping prisoners escape remained so fundamentally incompatible with their worldview that it simply could not register as a possibility, even when the evidence was standing directly in front of them. February brought news from the Eastern Front that filtered through the camp in whispers and official pronouncements that contradicted each other with increasing obviousness. The Red Army was advancing. That much was clear despite the propaganda about strategic withdrawals and elastic defense, and everyone from the commandant down to the lowest prisoner understood that the war was entering a new phase, where Germany's eventual defeat had shifted from possible to probable. This knowledge created strange effects throughout the camp's social ecosystem, as guards and prisoners alike began thinking about what would happen when the Soviets arrived and who would be held accountable for what. Some guards became more brutal, adopting a mentality that since they would be condemned anyway, they might as well earn their punishment, while others became noticeably less enthusiastic about enforcement, quietly hoping that mercy shown now might be remembered later. Müller observed these shifts with the detachment of someone who had already accepted his probable death and was now concerned only with maximizing the good he could do before the end arrived. On February 14th, a date Müller would remember for the rest of his brief life, he encountered a prisoner during his patrol who was attempting to reach the Eastern Gate but had collapsed from exhaustion and cold approximately 30 meters short of his goal. The man was a French political prisoner named Claude Rousseau, a resistance organizer who had been betrayed by an informant and sent to Gross Rosen 3 months earlier, and he lay in the snow barely conscious but still trying to crawl forward toward the fence line. Müller stood over him for what felt like an eternity, knowing that regulations required him to either shoot the man immediately or sound the alarm and have him dragged to the punishment block where he would be tortured for information about escape plans before being hanged as an example. Instead, Müller did something he had never done before and would never do again. He spoke directly to a prisoner as a human being, rather than an object of contempt or pity. The words Müller whispered were in broken French, a language he had studied briefly in school before the war destroyed any notion of international cooperation or cultural exchange. He told Rousseau that the gate was unlocked, that he had 17 minutes to reach it and get through before the next patrol, and that if he was caught, Müller would deny everything and shoot him to protect his own cover. Rousseau looked up at him with eyes that held a confusion so profound it momentarily overrode even the desperation of his situation, unable to process why an SS guard was giving him escape instructions rather than a bullet. Müller did not wait for understanding or gratitude. He simply continued his patrol route at the standard pace, forcing himself not to look back, trusting that Rousseau would either find the strength to complete those final 30 meters or would die in the attempt. And either outcome was preferable to the certain death that awaited if Müller followed his orders and turned the man in. When Müller completed his route and returned past the eastern gate 16 minutes later, Rousseau was gone, and the gate stood slightly ajar, evidence that someone had passed through it without bothering to close it properly behind them. Müller secured the gate and noted the time in his log, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him, and he wondered if speaking to Rousseau had been an act of compassion or a moment of weakness that would ultimately compromise everything. He had broken his most important rule by revealing himself, by stepping out from behind the mask of institutional indifference, and he understood that if Rousseau was captured and interrogated, the entire operation would unravel and everyone who had escaped using the Eastern Gate would be retroactively condemned as beneficiaries of treason. The rest of his shift passed in a fog of anxiety that did not lift until roll call the next morning confirmed that Rousseau had successfully vanished, one more ghost fleeing into the Polish winter. March arrived with false spring weather that melted the snow into mud and transformed the camp into a freezing swamp, where prisoners sank ankle-deep with every step during their forced marches to the work sites. The improving weather brought renewed construction efforts as the camp administration prepared for an expected influx of prisoners being evacuated from camps closer to the advancing Soviet lines, and Müller found himself assigned to additional day shifts, supervising prisoner work details that were expanding the barracks capacity. These daylight hours exposed him to aspects of camp brutality he had previously avoided through his night shift isolation, and he watched guards beat prisoners for moving too slowly, shoot men who collapsed from exhaustion, and laugh about it over lunch as if they were discussing the weather rather than murder. The cognitive dissonance of being part of this system while simultaneously sabotaging it became almost unbearable, and Müller began to disassociate during his day shifts, performing his duties with mechanical precision while his mind retreated to some interior space where he did not have to acknowledge what his hands were doing. The expansion project brought new guards to Gross Rosen, including several younger SS recruits who had been stationed at Auschwitz and carried with them an air of casual genocide that shocked even the hardened veterans of the labor camp system. These men spoke openly about the industrial-scale murder they had participated in, discussing methods of efficient killing with the same tone that factory workers might use to debate production techniques, and their presence injected a new level of ideological fanaticism into the guard barracks. Müller found himself increasingly isolated among his peers because he could not participate in their conversations without revealing his disgust. But silence in the face of their stories was interpreted as agreement, and so he became complicit through his unwillingness to expose himself by objecting. He understood with growing clarity that there would be no redemption for what he had witnessed and enabled, that unlocking a gate and saving perhaps 20 or 30 lives could never balance the scales against the thousands he had watched die without intervention, and this knowledge settled into his bones like a cancer that no amount of resistance could cure. Dietrich's security regime had evolved into a sustainable pattern by mid-March, and Müller had successfully mapped its rhythms well enough to resume his unlocking operation with calculated regularity. He left the gate unsecured approximately twice per week, always on nights when multiple factors aligned in his favor. Dietrich occupied elsewhere, the laziest guards on midnight shift, weather conditions that reduced visibility, and most importantly, his own psychological state stable enough to maintain perfect operational discipline. The escapes continued at a rate slow enough to avoid triggering intensive investigation, but frequent enough that Müller felt he was making some small difference in the vast machinery of death that surrounded him. He developed a ritual of counting each suspected successful escape as a mark on the inside of his belt, tiny scratches invisible to casual inspection, but tangible proof that his actions had meaning beyond his own survival. The first week of April brought a crisis that exposed just how fragile Müller's entire operation had always been. A prisoner named Jakob Stein, a Polish Jew who had survived 18 months in the camp through a combination of luck and strategic cooperation with the prisoner hierarchy, was caught attempting to bribe a guard for information about escape routes. Under torture in the punishment block, Stein revealed that prisoners had been monitoring guard patterns around the Eastern Gate and had identified what they believed to be a security weakness during the late-night patrol changeover. The investigation that followed was swift and brutal, with Dietrich personally interrogating every guard who had worked the eastern perimeter in the previous 3 months, examining patrol logs with microscopic attention, and conducting physical tests of the gate lock mechanism to determine if it had been tampered with or was simply defective. Müller endured his interrogation with outward calm, while internally calculating whether he should attempt to flee, commit suicide, or simply wait to see if his careful operational security would hold against serious scrutiny. What saved Müller was not his own cleverness, but rather institutional dynamics he could never have predicted or controlled. The commandant, Reinhardt, was furious at Dietrich for conducting an investigation that implied previous security failures, because any such failures would reflect poorly on Reinhardt's leadership in reports to Berlin. Rather than allow Dietrich to expose systemic problems that might threaten his own position, Reinhardt effectively sabotaged the investigation by declaring that Stein's testimony was unreliable due to the torture used to extract it, that the Eastern Gate had been tested and found secure, and that the entire matter was simply a prisoner's desperate fantasy rather than evidence of actual security breaches. Dietrich was forced to abandon his investigation or directly challenge his superior officer, and he chose careerism over truth, filing a report that attributed the incident to prisoner delusion while privately seething at being undermined. Müller watched this bureaucratic warfare unfold and understood that he had been saved not by his own actions, but by the same corrupt self-interest that made the entire camp system possible in the first place. The investigation's aftermath created a paradoxical situation where security around the Eastern Gate actually decreased because Reinhardt's official conclusion had declared it secure, and questioning that conclusion now would implicitly challenge the commandant's judgment and competence. Dietrich reassigned his attention to other areas of the camp, convinced that if escapes were occurring, they must be happening through routes not yet identified, and the midnight shift guards interpreted the whole episode as confirmation that their minimal efforts were adequate, since nothing had been found wrong with their procedures. Müller recognized this window of reduced scrutiny as perhaps his last opportunity to maximize the impact of his sabotage before the inevitable end came, whether through discovery, Soviet liberation, or the camp's complete liquidation as the front lines drew closer. He began leaving the gate unlocked 3 or sometimes 4 times per week, taking risks that his earlier cautious self would have considered suicidal, driven by a fatalistic urgency that accepted his death as already determined and concerned itself only with the count of lives saved before that death arrived. Late April brought the first concrete evidence that the war was entering its final phase, when prisoners arriving from evacuated eastern camps brought stories of Soviet atrocities against SS personnel and the summary executions of anyone associated with camp administration. These accounts, whether accurate or exaggerated, created panic among the guards, who began to understand that their uniforms had transformed them from perpetrators into targets, and that the advancing Red Army would make no distinctions between enthusiastic murderers and reluctant participants in the machinery of genocide. Some guards began planning their own escapes, discussing in hushed conversations how they might shed their uniforms and disappear into the chaos of Germany's collapse, while others doubled down on brutality with the logic that they were already condemned and might as well fulfill their roles completely. Müller observed these reactions with detached interest, knowing that his own fate was sealed regardless of whether he died as an SS guard or was exposed as a traitor, and finding a strange peace in the certainty that no future awaited him beyond the next few weeks or months. The most successful escape facilitated by Müller's unlocked gate occurred on the night of April 23rd, when a coordinated group of 7 prisoners, including 2 Soviet officers and 5 Polish resistance members made it through the eastern perimeter and vanished into the surrounding countryside. This escape was different from the previous desperate individual attempts because it had been carefully planned by the camp's underground resistance network, which had finally overcome its suspicion that the Eastern Gate weakness was a trap and had decided to risk a major operation. The group moved with military precision, timing their approach to coincide exactly with Müller's patrol schedule, and they were gone so efficiently that their absence was not discovered until morning roll call revealed a discrepancy that could not be explained away. The camp erupted into the most intensive security response since Dietrich's arrival. With dogs brought in to track the escapees, local police alerted to watch for suspicious persons, and guards subjected to another round of interrogations about their procedures and potential complicity. Müller's interrogation this time was conducted by Reinhardt himself, who seemed less interested in discovering the truth than in finding someone to blame for an escape that would certainly be reported to Berlin and reflected poorly on his leadership. The commandant's questions were aggressive and accusatory, but they focused primarily on whether Müller had seen anything suspicious, whether he had noticed unauthorized prisoner movements, whether he believed any of his fellow guards might be careless or corrupt. Müller answered each question with perfect military bearing, providing detailed accounts of his patrol procedures, offering observations about other guards that were critical enough to deflect suspicion, but not so critical as to seem like he was deliberately redirecting blame. He had learned long ago that the best lies are built on frameworks of truth, and so he described his actual patrol route, his actual lock-checking procedures, and his actual observations, simply omitting the one crucial detail that he deliberately left the gate unsecured. The interrogation lasted 2 hours and ended with Reinhardt dismissing him with a warning that if another escape occurred on his watch, Müller would be held personally responsible, regardless of whether negligence could be proven. The 7 escapees were never recaptured, a fact that Dietrich reported to Reinhardt with barely concealed fury, and that Reinhardt reported to Berlin with creative reinterpretation that attributed the escape to unprecedented prisoner sophistication rather than security failures. For Müller, the knowledge that 7 men had made it to freedom because of his actions provided a moment of pure satisfaction that briefly lifted the suffocating weight of guilt and complicity he carried every waking hour. He added 7 more scratches to the inside of his belt, bringing his total count to 38 confirmed or suspected successful escapes, and he wondered if that number was enough to matter in any cosmic accounting of his sins, knowing the answer was almost certainly no, but finding meaning in the attempt regardless. May of 1945 arrived with the unmistakable sound of artillery fire audible in the distance, a rolling thunder that grew incrementally louder each day as the Soviet advance compressed the remaining German-held territory like a closing fist. The camp administration received orders to begin evacuating prisoners westward in forced marches that everyone understood were death marches designed to prevent liberation and eliminate witnesses to what had occurred within the wire. Müller watched columns of skeletal prisoners being herded onto roads with minimal supplies and no clear destination, knowing that most would die from exhaustion or be shot by guards when they could no longer walk, and the sheer scale of this final atrocity made his small acts of sabotage seem pathetically inadequate in retrospect. The camp was being liquidated in stages, with the weakest prisoners murdered outright and dumped in mass graves, while those deemed strong enough to survive the march were driven west into the disintegrating remnants of the Third Reich. On the night of May 7th, with perhaps 200 prisoners remaining in the camp, and Soviet forces estimated to be less than 30 kilometers away, Müller made a decision that transcended everything he had done before. Rather than simply leaving the eastern gate unlocked, he removed the lock entirely and hid it in the forest, then wedged the gate open approximately 15 centimeters with a stone positioned to look like natural settlement rather than deliberate sabotage. He then walked to the guard barracks and told the midnight shift that he was ill and needed to be relieved early, a request granted immediately by guards who were themselves preparing to abandon their posts and flee before the Soviets arrived. Müller returned to his quarters, retrieved his service pistol and the small amount of personal effects he intended to carry, and walked away from Gross Rosen without authorization or plan, becoming a deserter in the final hours of a war that was already lost. He made it approximately 8 kilometers before exhaustion, and the understanding that he had nowhere to go forced him to stop in the abandoned farmhouse, where he sat in the darkness, listening to artillery grow closer, and wondering what he had actually accomplished with his months of secret resistance. The arithmetic was brutal and unforgiving. 38 prisoners possibly saved against thousands who had died while he stood by and followed orders, a ratio so disproportionate that claiming moral credit for the smaller number felt like an obscene joke. But then he thought about Claude Rousseau and the 7 men from the coordinated escape and all the others whose names he would never know. And he understood that from their perspective, from the perspective of someone who had been saved, the numbers were irrelevant because their entire world had been preserved. The lives he saved might be statistically meaningless against the totality of the Holocaust, but statistics were abstractions and lives were specific and individual, and perhaps meaning existed not in the numbers but in the act itself, in the choice to resist even when resistance was insufficient. Dawn on May 8th brought the sound of Soviet voices and the rumble of tank engines moving through the surrounding countryside, and Müller made the decision to surrender rather than attempt to blend into the civilian population. He walked out of the farmhouse with his hands raised and his SS uniform still on, and he was immediately surrounded by Soviet soldiers who seemed surprised to encounter a German guard voluntarily giving himself up rather than fighting or fleeing. Through a translator, Müller attempted to explain what he had done at Gross Rosen, the unlocked gate and the escaped prisoners, but his words were met with skepticism and contempt because the Soviets had already liberated multiple camps and heard countless guards claim they had secretly helped prisoners or were just following orders. They did not believe him, and he understood that he had no evidence to offer beyond the testimony of prisoners who had escaped and would never know his name, or that his actions had been deliberate rather than accidental incompetence. Müller was transported to a processing facility where captured SS personnel were being sorted for trial or execution, and he spent 3 days in a crowded cell with other guards from various camps, all of whom told stories about how they had been different, had tried to help, had never personally killed anyone even as they stood watch over industrialized murder. He stopped trying to distinguish himself from them because he realized that from the outside, from the perspective of the victims and liberators, there was no meaningful distinction between a guard who murdered enthusiastically and a guard who murdered reluctantly, or a guard who enabled murder while occasionally helping someone escape. They had all worn the same uniform and served the same system, and individual variations in moral compromise were ultimately irrelevant to the collective guilt they shared. On his 4th day in Soviet custody, Müller was taken from his cell for interrogation, and he never returned. The official Soviet records list Hans Müller as executed on May 12, 1945, following a summary tribunal that convicted him of crimes against humanity based solely on his SS service at Gross Rosen. No transcript of his interrogation survived, and if he attempted to explain his actions to his captors, those explanations were either not recorded or were dismissed as the predictable lies of a war criminal seeking to avoid responsibility. He was 33 years old at the time of his death, and he left behind no wife, no children, no letters or diary that might have documented his secret campaign of sabotage. The only physical evidence of his existence was his name on guard rosters and his signature on patrol logs that documented his presence at a camp where thousands died. And these documents told the story of a perpetrator rather than a conflicted saboteur who had tried in his inadequate way to resist the machine from within. What makes Müller's story accessible to historians today is not German records, which were largely destroyed as the Reich collapsed, but rather the testimony of survivors who escaped from Gross Rosen and eventually came forward decades later with accounts of the mysteriously unlocked Eastern Gate. Claude Rousseau, the French resistance member who Müller had spoken to directly, survived the war and spent 40 years believing his escape had been the result of simple guard negligence, before learning in a survivors' conference in 1985 that multiple other escapees remembered the same pattern of the Eastern Gate being periodically unsecured. The collective testimony of 11 survivors, pieced together through interviews conducted by Holocaust researchers in the late 1980s and early 1990s, gradually revealed that the gate weakness had been too consistent and too predictable to be accidental, and that someone within the guard structure must have been deliberately creating opportunities for escape. Rousseau became obsessed with identifying his unknown benefactor, spending his final years searching through captured SS records and conducting interviews with surviving guards who had been stationed at Gross Rosen during the relevant period. Most guards he contacted either refused to speak with him or claimed to remember nothing useful. But one former Wehrmacht soldier who had served on midnight shift mentioned in a 1992 interview that he had always found it strange how the evening patrol guard Müller had been so meticulous about paperwork, but had somehow consistently failed to properly secure the Eastern Gate despite being otherwise competent. The statement was offhand, and the witness did not seem to grasp its significance, but for Rousseau it was the confirmation he had been seeking. He obtained Müller's service record, learned of his execution by Soviet forces, and dedicated the remaining 3 years of his life to documenting what he believed was a profound act of moral courage that had been buried beneath the overwhelming narrative of SS criminality. The story Rousseau constructed from fragments and testimony was published posthumously in 1998 as a small article in a French Holocaust Studies journal, and it attracted minimal attention outside academic circles because Müller's actions, while personally meaningful to the few dozen prisoners he likely saved, were statistically insignificant in the context of a genocide that murdered 6 million Jews and millions of others. The dominant historical narrative had no clear category for a perpetrator, who was also partially a rescuer, for someone who enabled murder through his service while simultaneously undermining that same system through selective sabotage. Müller's story was too morally complicated for popular consumption, too ambiguous for those seeking clear heroes and villains, and so it remained obscure, a footnote in the extensive documentation of the Holocaust. But for the 38 people whose scratches Müller carved into his belt, and for their children and grandchildren who exist, because those 38 survived, the statistical insignificance is irrelevant. Each life saved was an entire world preserved, complete with all the futures and relationships and possibilities that radiated forward from the moment of escape. Among the descendants of Müller's escapees are doctors, teachers, artists, and 3 Holocaust educators who lecture about the complexity of moral choice during genocide, using the story of the unknown SS guard who unlocked the gate as a way to explore the difficult truth that humanity can exist, even in those who serve in human systems. They do not argue that Müller's actions absolve him of his complicity, do not claim he was a hero, rather than a conflicted perpetrator seeking insufficient redemption. But they insist that his story matters because it demonstrates that choice remained possible even in the heart of the machine, and that some people chose resistance even when that resistance was inadequate and ultimately futile. The question that haunts anyone who examines Hans Müller's story deeply is not whether what he did was sufficient, because clearly it was not, but rather what his example reveals about the nature of moral responsibility in systems designed to eliminate moral choice. The Nazi camp system functioned precisely because it distributed guilt so widely that individual responsibility became diffuse and deniable, allowing thousands of ordinary people to participate in genocide while telling themselves they were merely following orders or doing their assigned jobs. Müller's decision to sabotage that system from within, even in his limited way, represents a rejection of that comfortable diffusion of responsibility, an assertion that individual moral agency persisted even when institutional structures existed specifically to suppress it. His story does not offer redemption or absolution, but it does offer evidence that the claim of having no choice was always a lie that people told themselves to avoid the terrifying consequences of choosing differently. The most troubling aspect of Müller's legacy is how completely it was erased by the binary categories that emerged from World War II, categories that demanded people be sorted cleanly into perpetrators or victims, collaborators or resistors, guilty or innocent. Müller fit none of these categories comfortably because he was simultaneously all of them, a guard who enabled atrocity through his service while also undermining that atrocity through selective sabotage, a man who saved dozens while standing by as thousands died. The historical record had no language for such moral complexity, and so it defaulted to the simplest categorization available. He wore an SS uniform and served at a death camp, Therefore, he was a perpetrator whose execution was justified and unremarkable. The possibility that he might also have been something else, something more complicated, was lost because acknowledging such complexity threatened the clear moral narratives that societies needed to process the incomprehensible scale of the Holocaust. In the decades since Rousseau's research brought Müller's story to limited academic attention, it has been cited in exactly 17 scholarly works, most of them examining the theoretical possibility of resistance within totalitarian systems rather than celebrating Müller himself as any kind of hero. Modern Holocaust educators struggle with how to present his case because it resists easy moral conclusions and potentially provides ammunition for those seeking to minimize SS criminality by pointing to exceptional cases of individual decency. The consensus among serious historians is that Müller's story should be told but contextualized carefully, presented not as evidence that the SS contained secret heroes, but rather as a demonstration of how rare and difficult resistance was, and how even those who attempted it remained complicit in the larger machinery of genocide. His 38 saved lives are real and meaningful, but they exist alongside his participation in a system that murdered thousands, and both truths must be held simultaneously without allowing either to cancel the other. The Eastern Gate at Gross Rosen no longer exists. The camp was partially demolished after the war, and what remains has been converted into a memorial and museum that receives approximately 20,000 visitors annually. The exhibits document the camp's history, the prisoners who died there, and the liberation by Soviet forces, but there is no mention of Hans Müller or the unlocked gate, because the evidence for his story is fragmentary and his moral status is too ambiguous for memorial spaces that serve primarily to honor victims rather than explore the complexity of perpetrators. Visitors walk past the approximate location where the Eastern Gate once stood without knowing that it was a portal between death and possibility, that for exactly 17 minutes on certain nights in 1943 and 1944, it represented the slimmest chance at survival that some desperate prisoners managed to seize. The final word on Hans Müller comes from one of the survivors whose escape he facilitated, a Polish Jew named David Blum, who made it through the Eastern Gate in February of 1944 and eventually immigrated to Israel, where he lived until his death in 2006. In an interview conducted shortly before he died, Blum was asked whether he thought the unknown guard who left the gate unlocked deserved recognition or condemnation, and his answer captured the irresolvable moral paradox at the heart of the story. He said that if he believed in a God who kept accounts, he imagined that God would judge the guard harshly for his complicity, but would also note the scratches on his belt, and that perhaps in the incomprehensible mathematics of divine justice, those scratches might mean something even if they could never balance the scales. Then Blum added that he personally did not believe in such a God, but that he was alive to have this conversation because someone had made a choice when they could have chosen differently, and that in the end, the meaning of that choice was simply this: he lived, his children lived, his grandchildren lived, and that was both everything and not nearly enough.